He did not look at her, not once, not even as he slid the cold weight of the Blackwood ring onto her finger. The stone was a sapphire, deep and starless as a winter sea, and it felt less like a gift than a manacle. Lady Althea stood beside him at the altar of the Chapel Royal, a study in ivory silk and quiet compliance, the very model of a well-bred, suitably silent bride. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and beeswax, a cloying sweetness that failed to mask the metallic tang of a transaction. She was the daughter of a deceased baron with a distinguished lineage and an empty purse. He was the Duke of Blackwood, in need of an heir and a respectable, uncomplicated duchess after the spectacular, ruinous scandal of his first betrothal. Theirs was a match of convenience, a neat piece of social arithmetic, and Althea was the sum. All of London society was there to witness it, their collective gaze a physical pressure. She could feel their appraisal. The girl was plain, but her blood was good. Her gown was modest, but her posture was impeccable. She was, they would murmur over champagne and glacéd fruits, a sensible choice, a safe harbor after the tempest of Lady Isabel. Althea had heard the story in hushed tones from her lady's maid, the beautiful, vivacious Isabel, who had captured the Duke's heart only to shatter it, jilting him for a richer marquess and exposing certain of the Duke's financial follies in the process. The wound had evidently been deep, for it had carved the man beside her from stone. His Grace, Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, moved with a rigid, chilling grace. He was handsome in a severe architectural way, his features sharp and his expression shuttered. When his vows were spoken, the words were clear, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. They were the terms of a contract, read aloud for the record. When it was her turn, Althea's voice was low but steady. She would not tremble. She would not give him or the watching world the satisfaction of her sorrow. She was her father's daughter, and her father, a scholar of antiquities and a man of immense fortitude, had taught her that dignity was the one possession no one could take from you. It was a lesson she had studied well in the years since his death, a year that had dismantled her world and led her to this cold altar. The reception was a glittering ordeal at Blackwood House, his London residence, a palace of pale marble and gilded plaster. It was filled with a suffocating magnificence. Althea stood by his side, a ghost at her own feast, accepting the congratulations of people whose names she would never remember. The Duke performed his duties with the same remote efficiency he had displayed at the altar. He was courteous, he was correct, and he was 1,000 miles away. He spoke to her only when necessary, his words brief inquiries into her comfort that were not inquiries at all, but statements of social obligation. She did not cry when, later that evening, in a private drawing room that felt colder than the chapel, he laid out the terms of her new existence. Her hands were folded in her lap, the new ring a heavy, alien presence on her finger. "You will not be joining me at Ashworth, my primary seat," he stated, his voice as neutral as if he were discussing the rotation of crops. He stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantel, his profile to her. "I have found it is better for my work, and for the management of the estates, that I am not distracted." The word hung in the air between them, a small, polished cruelty. Distracted. As if she were a flighty girl with a lapdog and a case of the vapors, instead of a woman who had managed her father's failing estate for 2 years with nothing but his books and her own sharp mind. "I see," she said. Her own voice sounded distant to her ears. There is another property, he continued, still not looking at her. Stonefall. It is in the north. It was my mother's property, from the dower lands. It has not been inhabited for some years. Althea knew of Stonefall. Her father had possessed a book on the great castles of England, and Stonefall had been given a melancholic chapter. A medieval fortress, perched on the edge of the moors, renowned for its stark beauty and its state of near ruin. It was where the Blackwood dukes sent things they wished to forget. Mad uncles, disgraced cousins, and now, it seemed, inconvenient wives. A staff has been arranged for you, sufficient for your needs, he said. You will have an allowance. You may draw upon it for whatever you require. He was giving her a gilded cage, a comfortable exile. He was banishing her. The humiliation was so profound, so complete, that it circled past pain and arrived at a strange, quiet clarity. She had expected coldness, but she had not expected erasure. He was not merely neglecting her, he was disposing of her. "And my duties, Your Grace?" she asked, the formal address a shield. "As Duchess." For the first time, he turned his head and met her gaze. His eyes were a startling gray, the color of a stormy sky, and for a fleeting second, she saw something beyond the coldness, a flicker of profound, weary bitterness. "Your duty," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "is to remain Duchess of Blackwood. Nothing more." It was a dismissal, a life sentence to irrelevance. Althea inclined her head, a gesture of submission that felt like a declaration of war. He thought her a simple, placid creature to be stored away and forgotten. He had no idea who he had married. He had no conception of the resources that lay dormant behind her quiet eyes. He had looked at her, but he had not seen her. And in that moment, in the cold heart of his London palace, Althea made a silent vow. He could send her to a ruin, but she would not be one. The journey north took 4 days. The Duke's finest traveling carriage was a lacquered black box, sprung and cushioned, but it could not smooth the rutted roads or keep out the pervasive damp of the late autumn rains. Althea sat opposite her maid, Elspeth, a woman as spare and sturdy as the northern fells themselves, who had been with her since she was a child. Elspeth's silence was a comfort, a shared language of endurance. She did not offer pity, for which Althea was grateful. She simply ensured the traveling rug was tucked in, that the flask of weak tea was warm, and that the book on Althea's lap, a worn copy of Vitruvius's De Architectura from her father's library, was not jostled. As they traveled, the landscape changed. The gentle, manicured greens of the south gave way to rolling hills, then to the stark, dramatic emptiness of the moors. The sky seemed to grow larger, a vast canvas of shifting grays and bruised purples. There was a wild, untamed beauty to it that spoke to a place deep inside Althea, a part of her that had always felt constrained by the neat hedgerows and polite society of her former life. This was a land that did not pretend to be soft. It was honest in its harshness. On the evening of the 4th day, the carriage turned off the main road and onto a track that was little more than 2 deep grooves in the earth. The driver slowed the horses to a walk. Through the misting rain, Althea saw it. Stonefall. It did not rise so much as claw its way out of the rocky tor on which it was built. It was a fortress of dark, weather-beaten stone, its crenellations stark against the bruised twilight sky. One of the main towers was a jagged ruin, struck by lightning a century ago and never repaired. The windows were dark, vacant eyes. It was not a house. It was a monument to decay. The carriage shuddered to a halt in a courtyard overgrown with weeds. The air, when the footman opened the door, was cold and smelled of wet stone and loneliness. An elderly woman stood at the top of a short flight of worn stone steps, a single lantern held aloft in her hand. Her face was a road map of wrinkles, her expression grim and wary. This, Althea presumed, was the sufficient staff. "Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood," the footman announced, his voice sounding absurdly formal in the oppressive silence. The old woman gave a curt, stiff curtsy. "Mrs. Gable, Your Grace. I am the housekeeper." Althea ascended the steps, her silk traveling dress feeling flimsy and foolish against the raw power of the place. The lantern light cast flickering, monstrous shadows. "Mrs. Gable," Althea said, her voice steady. "I am pleased to make your acquaintance." Mrs. Gable's gaze was sharp, missing nothing. It took in Althea's plain, tired face, her simple gown, her lack of entourage beyond a single stoic maid. This was not the sort of Duchess Stonefall had ever known. "The Duke wrote that we were to expect you," Mrs. Gable said, her tone implying this was an unfortunate but unavoidable fact. "We have prepared a room." She led them inside. If the exterior was a monument to decay, the interior was its tomb. The great hall was a cavern of shadows, the air thick with the dust of decades. Furniture huddled under ghostly white dustcloths. A tapestry depicting a long-forgotten battle hung in tatters from one wall, its threads unraveled like weeping wounds. The cold was a living thing. It seeped up from the flagstones and radiated from the stone walls. It was a cold that had settled into the very bones of the castle. Mrs. Gable led them up a grand, decaying staircase to a wing that was marginally less derelict. "The west wing is uninhabitable," she stated flatly. "The roof has failed. This is the south wing. We have aired the rooms as best we can." The suite prepared for Althea was large, paneled in dark oak, and furnished with heavy, severe pieces that seemed to absorb what little light there was. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but it was a sullen, smoky thing that offered little cheer and less warmth. It was a room to be endured, not inhabited. Elspeth began to unpack, her movements efficient and angry. She slammed a drawer shut, the sound echoing in the funereal quiet. "It is a disgrace, my lady," she muttered, her back to Althea. "To send you to this tomb." Althea walked to the tall, arched window and pushed open the heavy casement. The rain had stopped. The wind sighed across the moors, a lonely, ancient sound. Below, the castle's gardens were a tangled wreck of thorns and overgrown shrubs. But beyond them, under the light of a watery moon, the land stretched out, vast and dark and beautiful. She did not feel despair. The emotion that rose in her was something else, something colder and more powerful. It was a feeling she recognized from the long nights after her father's death, when she had sat with the estate ledgers, faced with ruin, and had chosen not to weep, but to work. She turned from the window. Mrs. Gable was still standing in the doorway, watching her with that unreadable, assessing gaze. "Mrs. Gable," Althea said, her voice quiet but clear. "How many staff are in residence?" The housekeeper blinked, surprised by the question. "Myself, Your Grace. My husband, who serves as groundsman when his rheumatics allow, and 2 girls from the village who help with the cleaning." "4," Althea said, a small, grim nod. And the tenants on the estate? There are 6 tenant farms still paying rent. The rest of the land lies fallow. Althea looked around the cavernous, cold room. She looked at the peeling plaster, the dust motes dancing in the moonlight. She saw not an ending, but a beginning, a problem. A vast, intricate, glorious problem. The Duke had given her a ruin. He thought he had sentenced her to a life of quiet irrelevance. "Tomorrow morning," Althea said, her voice infused with a purpose that startled even herself, "I should like to see the estate ledgers, all of them, and the keys to all the rooms, even the ones in the west wing." Mrs. Gable stared at her. The grim mask of her face flickered with something new, a spark of disbelief, perhaps, or grudging respect. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said, and for the first time, the title did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like a possibility. Althea did not sleep in the grand, cold bed. She sat in a chair by the dying fire, wrapped in a traveling cloak, and listened to the bones of the castle settle around her. She was not a prisoner. She was its new custodian, and the work was about to begin. The first week, Althea did nothing but walk and read, accompanied by the silent, watchful Mr. Gable, whose rheumatics seemed to ease in the face of this strange new duchess's quiet determination. She walked the bounds of the Stonefall estate. She traced the lines of crumbling dry stone walls, inspected the sagging roofs of tenant cottages, and paced the waterlogged fields that had once been productive pasture. She did not speak much, but she saw everything. She noted the species of weeds choking the old kitchen garden, the direction of the prevailing wind, the places where drainage ditches had collapsed and turned good land into marsh. In the evenings, she sat not in her cold staterooms, but in a small, disused office she had claimed near the kitchens. The air there was warmer, smelling of baking bread and Mrs. Gable's herbal infusions. She had the estate ledgers, great leather-bound tomes filled with the spidery, elegant script of generations of Blackwood stewards. They were a history of slow decline. Accounts had been neglected, rents unadjusted for decades, profitable assets forgotten. In a dusty deed box, she found records of timber rights in a nearby copse, untouched for 50 years. She discovered that the stone quarry on the far edge of the estate, long considered defunct, had been abandoned not because it was exhausted, but because of a dispute with a neighboring landowner, a dispute resolved by his death 30 years prior. Mrs. Gable would bring her a cup of chamomile tea, her expression still wary, but the wariness was now tinged with a deep, consuming curiosity. "His Grace, the old Duke's father, he used to take an interest," she offered one evening, watching Althea's pen scratch across a fresh sheet of paper, making calculations. "But the last Duke, and this one, they have not set foot here in my lifetime." "They had other concerns," Althea said, her tone neutral. She would not speak ill of her husband to his servants. "Concerns in London cost money," Mrs. Gable observed, her voice dry as kindling. "Concerns here, they make it." It was the beginning of their alliance. By the second month, the rhythm of Stonefall had changed. Althea hired a dozen men from the village, not as servants, but as laborers. They began by clearing the collapsed drainage ditches, their shovels ringing against stone in the crisp morning air. Under Althea's direction, guided by a text on land reclamation her father had treasured, they started the slow work of turning the marsh back into pasture. She used the forgotten timber rights to hire a sawyer, who began felling select mature oaks, providing wood for the repairs and a surplus to sell in the nearby market town. She sent for a Mr. Thorne, a land agent and architect from York,
whose name she had found in her father's correspondence, recommended for his honesty and his innovative ideas. He arrived on a blustery Tuesday, a man in his 40s with intelligent eyes and hands stained with the ink of his trade. He expected a bored aristocratic lady with fanciful notions. He found a duchess in a plain woolen dress, her hands dusty from sorting through old survey maps, who could speak his own language. "The main issue with the West Wing roof is not merely the storm damage," she told him, spreading a drawing she had made on the great table in the hall. "It's the pitch. The original design was too shallow for a slate roof in a region with this much rainfall.
It puts too much stress on the king posts. I believe it should be rebuilt with a steeper pitch, and we could use stone tiles from our own quarry." Thorne stared at her drawing, then at her. He had been prepared to be diplomatic. He had not been prepared for a collaborator. "Your Grace," he said slowly, a grin spreading across his face. "You have saved me a week of survey work and a very difficult conversation with your steward." "I am the steward," Althea replied, without a trace of irony. Their partnership became the engine of Stonefall's revival. Thorne handled the structural plans for the castle, marvelling at a duchess who understood load-bearing walls and the chemical composition of lime mortar. Althea handled the logistics and the financing. She reopened the quarry, its high-quality stone finding a ready market. She negotiated new, fairer leases with the tenants, providing them with materials for repairs in exchange for a percentage of their increased yields. She did not command. She consulted. She walked to their farms, sat in their kitchens, and listened to their knowledge of the land, blending their inherited wisdom with the scientific principles from her father's books. The castle itself began to heal. The great, gaping wound in the west wing was scaffolded and then, slowly, meticulously, closed. Masons repointed the crumbling mortar. Glaziers replaced the dark, empty windows with new glass that caught the pale northern light. The gardens were cleared, the thorns and briars dug out to reveal the elegant bones of a formal garden, long asleep. Althea found the original plans in the library and began the work of replanting, choosing hardy, resilient species that could withstand the wind from the moors. Her own life found a new shape. She lived not in the grand, cold suite, but in a smaller set of rooms in the newly repaired wing, overlooking the reviving gardens. The rooms were simple, furnished with restored pieces from the castle's own stores. Her prize was the library. It had been a place of mould and decay, but now its shelves were repaired and polished, the books cleaned and catalogued. She spent her evenings there, her father's collection mingling with the Blackwood archives, the scent of old paper and beeswax a comforting perfume. She rarely thought of the Duke. He was a distant, abstract figure, the author of her exile, but not the master of her life. He sent the quarterly allowance to her bank in York, but Althea never touched it. She deposited it into a separate account, untouched. Stonefall was paying for its own rebirth. She was building a world for herself, a world of competence and purpose, walled not by stone, but by her own self-sufficiency. Sometimes, at night, when the wind howled around the battlements, a terrible loneliness would ache within her. But then morning would come, and there was work to be done. There were accounts to balance, plans to approve, a world to build. And in the building, she found a quiet, steady peace. The Duke had sent her to an empty castle, and she had filled it, not with furniture or servants, but with life. In London, the Duke of Blackwood was finding that life was a series of increasingly unpleasant surprises. The season was in full swing, a relentless carousel of balls, dinners, and political manoeuvring.
He moved through it all with his customary cold precision, his reputation as a formidable, unapproachable figure intact. But beneath the immaculate surface of his tailoring and the cool facade of his public life, fissures were beginning to appear. His investments, managed by a slick, confident man named Sterling, who had been recommended by the Marquis of Abernathy, the man who had married his former fiancée Isabel, were underperforming. Sterling was full of plausible explanations: market fluctuations, political instability, unforeseen downturns.
Alistair, whose mind was sharp, but whose knowledge of the new world of stocks and foreign bonds was limited, accepted the explanations with a growing sense of unease. His fortune, while substantial, was not infinite. The scandal with Isabel had cost him dearly, not just in pride, but in a marriage settlement that had been quietly paid to avoid further disgrace. He was not as wealthy as the world believed. He saw Isabel often. She was the reigning belle of the season, more beautiful and more dazzling than ever. She moved through society like a conquering general, her husband, the Marquess, a portly and pleased appendage. She treated Alistair with a kind of pitying familiarity that set his teeth on edge. "Alistair, my dear," she said one evening, tapping his arm with her fan at a particularly crowded ball. "You look so terribly serious. Does dukedom weigh so heavily?" "It is a responsibility, Isabel, not a diversion," he replied, his tone clipped. Her laughter was like the tinkling of ice in a glass. "Oh, always so principled. And how is your little duchess? Still rusticating in the north? I hear it's dreadfully bleak. Does she write you terribly sad letters?" "The duchess is well," he said, his jaw tightening. The truth was, she did not write at all. Beyond a single formal letter announcing her safe arrival, there had been nothing. His steward sent her the allowance. His bank confirmed it was received. That was the extent of their communication. He had wanted an uncomplicated wife. He had, it seemed, gotten one. But a strange rumor had begun to circulate, a whisper that reached him through a gossiping country cousin. It was said that something was happening at Stonefall, that the ruin was being repaired, that the duchess, his quiet, plain little bride, was managing the estate herself and turning a profit. He dismissed it as absurd country gossip. The woman he had married was a baron's daughter, raised to be decorative and silent. The notion of her running an estate was laughable. The rumor, however, was persistent. At his club, a fellow landowner with property bordering the Stonefall estate remarked on it. "Your Grace, your new duchess seems to have a miracle worker's touch. My tenants are complaining. Says your rents are fairer and your cottages are all being repaired, causing no end of trouble for my steward." The man had laughed, but Alistair did not. The seed of a disquieting curiosity was planted. He found himself thinking of her at odd moments, the quiet steadiness of her gaze at the altar, the way she had simply inclined her head when he had banished her. There had been no tears, no hysterics. It had been unnerving. The final push came, as it so often did, from Isabel. She approached him at a soirée at Abernathy House, her expression one of perfect malicious concern. "My dear Duke," she began, her voice low and conspiratorial, "I do hope you're paying attention to what is happening on your northern lands. I hear the most extraordinary tales." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "A woman, left to her own devices, with access to funds. Well, one hears of architects and agents given far too much familiarity." A pretty face can be very expensive. The insult was twofold, a slight against Althea's honor and a jab at his own past folly, for Isabel herself had been notoriously free with his funds. The venom in her tone was unmistakable. She wanted to believe his new wife was a fool or a wanton, a confirmation that he was destined to make poor choices in women. And it was this, her undisguised malice, that solidified Alistair's decision. If Isabel was so keen to see Althea fail, it was his duty to at least verify the state of affairs. He would not have his name dragged into another scandal because of a wife's incompetence. He announced his intention to travel north for a few weeks of hunting. Society would see it as a typical aristocratic pastime. Only he knew it was an inspection tour. He wrote a brief, formal note to Stonefall, a single sentence informing the Duchess of the date of his arrival. He did not request permission. He announced his presence. He was the master, after all. He was going to put an end to these ridiculous rumors and remind his quiet little Duchess precisely where her duties lay. He imagined arriving to find a house in charming disarray, a flustered wife, and a muddle of accounts that he would have to spend a week untangling. The thought was irritating, but also vaguely satisfying. It would restore the proper order of things. He would be in command. She would be dependent. It was, he told himself, how the world was meant to work. He had no idea that the world he was about to enter was one he no longer commanded at all. The Duke's journey north was the inverse of Althea's. He traveled in the same lacquered carriage, but where she had seen a landscape of stark, honest beauty, he saw only inconvenience. The roads were worse than he remembered, the inns more rustic, the weather more persistently grim. He arrived at the gates of Stonefall on a crisp, clear afternoon, the kind of day that throws every detail into sharp relief. And the first detail he noticed was that the gatehouse, which he recalled as a crumbling ruin, now had a sound roof and a freshly painted door. As his carriage swept into the courtyard, he felt a profound sense of dislocation. The weeds were gone, replaced by clean, raked gravel. The facade of the main keep, once a study in dereliction, was now a tapestry of old and new stone, the scars of centuries of neglect being meticulously healed. Scaffolding still clung to the west wing, but it was a sign of work, not decay. Men were calling to one another from the rooftops, the sound of hammers ringing in the clear air. It was not silent. It was alive. A stable boy, clean and alert, ran to the horses' heads. Mrs. Gable appeared at the top of the steps, but she was not the grim, solitary figure Althea had met. She was wearing a crisp apron, and her expression was not wary, but possessed of a formidable calm. She looked, Alistair thought with a jolt, like the housekeeper of a great house. "Your Grace," she said, her curtsy correct but not servile. "The Duchess was informed of your arrival. She is in the library." The great hall was the second shock. The dust cloths were gone. The air was clean, smelling of beeswax and wood smoke from the enormous fireplace where a cheerful blaze crackled. The tattered tapestry was gone, and the stone walls were clean. The furniture was not plentiful, but the pieces that remained had been polished to a deep luster. It was still a vast baronial space, but it was no longer a tomb. It was a room waiting for people to live in it. He followed Mrs. Gable up the main staircase, his footsteps echoing on the stone. She led him not to the old south wing, but toward the newly repaired west wing.
The corridor was bright, the plaster new and painted a warm, creamy white. The light flooding in from the new windows was revelatory. She stopped before a set of tall oak doors. "The Duchess is within, Your Grace." She did not wait for him, but turned and walked away, her footsteps brisk and purposeful. Alistair hesitated for a second, a strange feeling of being an intruder in his own house washing over him. He pushed the doors open. The library was a long, beautiful room, lined with books from floor to ceiling. The scent of old leather and paper was intoxicating. At the far end of the room, a woman stood on a rolling library ladder, her back to him, reaching for a book on a high shelf. She was wearing a simple dress of dark green wool, her hair pinned up in a practical but elegant knot. She was so absorbed in her task that she had not heard him enter. He knew it was his wife, but she did not look like the pale, submissive girl from the wedding. There was a confidence in her posture, a sense of purpose in her movements.
This was a woman entirely at home in her surroundings. "Althea," he said. She started, a slight, sharp intake of breath. She did not turn immediately. She carefully placed the book she had chosen into a basket hanging from the ladder. Then she descended with a calm, unhurried grace. When she finally faced him, her expression was one of cool, polite inquiry. There was no fluster, no fear, no pleased surprise. It was the look one might give to an unexpected but not entirely unwelcome visitor. "Your Grace," she said, her voice even. "Welcome to Stonefall. I trust your journey was not too arduous." "It was adequate," he managed, feeling oddly wrong-footed. He had expected to dominate the scene, to be the center of gravity. Instead, he felt like a superfluous object in a room that was perfectly complete without him. "You have been busy." It was a massive understatement. "There was much to be done," she replied, her gaze sweeping the room with a quiet pride he could not fail to notice. "A house like this requires attention." "I had heard rumors," he said, trying to regain his footing. "I confess I did not credit them." "Indeed," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. She knew he had not credited them. She knew he had sent her here to be forgotten. Her quiet, level gaze told him all of it. He walked further into the room, running a hand along a shelf of beautifully bound books. He recognized the crest of her father, the Baron of Northwood, on many of them. "This was your father's collection?" "A part of it," she said. "He believed books were meant to be used, not merely owned." There was a large table in the center of the room, covered not with flowers or decorative objects, but with architectural drawings, ledgers, and survey maps. It was a workspace, the nerve center of a massive operation. He picked up one of the drawings. It was a detailed cross-section of a barn, with notes in a neat, precise hand in the margins. Her hand. "Mr. Thorne, the architect, finds my sketches useful," she explained, without apology. Alistair put the drawing down. The sheer scale of what she had accomplished was beginning to dawn on him. This was not a wife playing at being a chatelaine. This was a master strategist at work. He had sent her to a ruin, and she had treated it not as a prison, but as a project. A vast, complex project that she was, by all appearances, winning. "I came to inspect the estate accounts," he said, the words sounding hollow and foolish even to his own ears. "Of course," she replied smoothly. She walked to the table and gestured to a thick new ledger bound in green leather. "They are all in order. The account for the last quarter shows a net profit of £2,000 after all expenses for the restoration have been deducted.
The funds from the quarry and the timber sales have been most satisfactory. I have opened a new account in the estate's name at the bank in York. The Duke's allowance remains untouched in a separate holding. She delivered this information with the calm proficiency of a steward reporting to his master. But she was not his steward. She was his wife. The woman he had dismissed and exiled. And she had just informed him, in the most polite and devastating way possible, that she did not need him. She had not used his money. She had created her own. He stood there in the magnificent library she had brought back from the dead, surrounded by the evidence of her intelligence and her industry, and felt a sensation he had not experienced in a very long time. He was impressed. And he was, to his profound astonishment, utterly, completely, and irrevocably intrigued. The quiet, plain girl was gone. In her place was a woman of substance and mystery. His wife, the Duchess of Blackwood. And he realized, with a shock that went deeper than any financial loss, that he did not know her at all. Alistair stayed at Stonefall for a fortnight.
He had intended it as an inspection, a reassertion of his authority. It became, instead, a period of profound and unsettling education. He did not hunt. He observed. He walked the estate, this time not as its owner, but as a visitor in a foreign land governed by unfamiliar laws. The laws were Althea's. He saw her meet with Mr. Thorne. The two of them bent over a drawing, their conversation a rapid exchange of technical terms he barely understood. He saw her speak with the tenant farmers, not with the condescending largesse of a lady of the manor, but with the focused attention of a peer. She knew their children's names, the specifics of the blight that had affected their potato crop last season, the exact location of the field that needed marling. They, in turn, spoke to her with the respect that bordered on reverence. It was not the deference due a duchess. It was the esteem earned by a leader. He tried at first to assert himself. "I believe the rents on the north pasture should be raised," he declared one morning at the breakfast table, an awkward, formal meal they took together in a small, sunlit parlour she had furnished. "The land is clearly more productive now." Althea placed her teacup carefully in its saucer. "The rents will be raised in 2 years' time, as per the new leases I negotiated," she stated, her tone mild but absolute. "The tenants invested their own labour in the initial reclamation. They are entitled to the first fruits of that investment. It builds trust, and trust is a more valuable asset than a few extra pounds this quarter." He had no answer to that. Her logic was unassailable. It was the logic of a builder, not an extractor. He was used to thinking of his estates as sources of income to fund his life in London. She thought of Stonefall as a living entity, a community to be nurtured. Their evenings were the strangest part. After a simple dinner, she would retire to the library. The first few nights he remained in the drawing room, staring into the fire, feeling like a guest in his own home. On the third night, he followed her. He found her at the great table, poring over a book on animal husbandry. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to a chair opposite her. "It is your library, Your Grace," she said, a hint of dry wit in her voice that surprised him. He sat. The silence between them was thick with unspoken things. He found himself wanting to fill it, but not knowing how. He, a man famed for his conversation in the most powerful drawing rooms in London, was rendered speechless by his own wife. "Tell me about the quarry," he said at last, the question sounding abrupt. And she did.
She explained the geology of the region, the specific qualities of the stone, the logistics of transporting it, the market she had found for it among the builders of a new infirmary in Manchester. Her knowledge was encyclopedic, her passion for the subject quiet but intense. He listened, fascinated. He had owned that quarry his entire life, and had known nothing of it beyond a line item in a forgotten ledger. He returned to London a changed man, though he would not have admitted it. The image of Althea, calm, competent, and entirely self-possessed, was imprinted on his mind. He found his London life, which had once seemed the centre of the world, now appeared brittle and strangely hollow. The pronouncements of politicians, the gossip of the drawing rooms, the endless posturing, it all seemed like a game for children compared to the real, tangible work being done at Stonefall. His return coincided with the beginning of his ruin. The first letter from his man of business, Sterling, was apologetic. A South American venture had failed, a significant loss but recoverable. The second letter, a month later, was more urgent. A railway speculation had collapsed. The losses were now substantial.
Alistair summoned Sterling, who appeared, sweating slightly, with a portfolio of charts and promises. "A temporary downturn, Your Grace. We must be bold." Alistair, his mind now accustomed to the clear, practical logic of his wife, found Sterling's reassurances slick and empty. But what could he do? His capital was tied up. To pull out now would be to crystallize the losses. He had no choice but to trust the man recommended by his most successful rival. The end came swiftly, and it was brutal. A terse note from his bank informed him of a massive, unauthorized withdrawal from his primary account. When he went to Sterling's offices, he found them empty. The clerks were bewildered. Mr. Sterling had left for the continent, they said, 2 days prior. He had liquidated every asset he could touch and vanished. The scale of the disaster was catastrophic. It was not just the speculative funds. Sterling had used his authority to leverage Alistair's core assets, forging his signature on loans against the unentailed properties. He was not just diminished. He was on the brink of absolute ruin. The news, as it always does, broke like a fever. Within a week, it was the talk of every club and drawing room in London. The Duke of Blackwood, the cold, proud man who had organized his life around the avoidance of a second humiliation, was publicly, spectacularly, financially destroyed. Isabel was magnificent in her performance of sympathy. She found him at a gathering he had forced himself to attend, a public show of defiance. "Alistair, my dear, it is a tragedy," she whispered, her eyes shining with what he now recognized as pure, unadulterated triumph. "To be ruined by a common swindler, after all your principles." She had recommended Sterling. She and her husband had likely taken a commission. They had profited from his trust, and now they were savoring his fall. He looked at her, at the beautiful, predatory face that had once held his heart, and felt nothing but a vast, arctic emptiness. He had built his life as a fortress against the memory of her betrayal, and in doing so, he had left the gates wide open for another. His pride had been a blindfold. He was surrounded by enemies and sycophants, a glittering court of people who now watched him with a mixture of pity and glee. He retreated to his grand, cold house on Grosvenor Square. The servants moved with a hushed, fearful tread. Creditors' letters began to arrive, a white tide of demands. He would have to sell everything. Ashworth, his ancestral seat, with its famous art collection and its manicured parks. The London house. Everything that constituted the Dukedom of Blackwood,
save the entailed title itself. He was a duke in name only, a hollow man in a hollow house. He sat alone in his study, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, the silence pressing in. He had lost everything. He had no one. He thought of his father, of the long line of Blackwood dukes who had built and maintained this legacy. And he, Alistair, had been the one to lose it all in a single season of foolish pride. It was in this moment of absolute despair that a letter was brought to him on a silver tray. The gesture seemed a mockery. The letter was not from a creditor. The envelope was plain, the hand unfamiliar. He broke the seal with numb fingers. It was not addressed to His Grace the Duke of Blackwood, but to Lord Blackwood. It was from the architect, Thorne, the man his wife had hired. The letter was brief and businesslike. "My lord," it began, "the Duchess asked that I forward to you the final accounts for the fiscal year at the Stonefall estate. She felt, given the news from London, that you would wish to have them sooner rather than later. The enclosed summary shows a net profit for the estate of £27,000. This is after all restoration costs, wages, and capital investments have been paid. The sum has been deposited in the estate account at York, to which you have access.
The quarry is projected to yield an even greater return next year. My lord, I have worked as an architect and agent for 20 years. I have never seen an estate so neglected turned to such staggering profitability in so short a time. It is a work of genius, and it is entirely, and without exception, the work of Her Grace, the Duchess. I remain your servant, Robert Thorne." Alistair read the letter once, then twice. He looked at the enclosed ledger sheet, at the neat columns of figures, at the final, impossible number at the bottom. £27,000. It was not enough to restore his fortune, not by half, but it was enough. It was enough to hold off the most pressing creditors. It was enough to stop the immediate, forced sale of Ashworth. It was a lifeline, a miracle. He let the pages fall from his hand. The truth of it crashed over him, a wave of such force it left him breathless. He had married a woman for her quiet, biddable nature, a woman he believed to be nothing more than a name and a lineage. He had dismissed her, exiled her, erased her from his life. He had sent her to his most worthless, ruined property with a pittance for an allowance, expecting her to fade into obscurity. And in her exile, with no help from him, using nothing but her own mind and the tattered books of her dead father, she had built an empire. She had taken his ruin and turned it into a refuge. She had taken his contempt and answered it with staggering competence. While he was being swindled in the glittering heart of London, she had been quietly, patiently, saving him. The quietly devastating sentence was not in Thorne's letter. It was in his own memory, the words he had spoken to her in this very house. "Your duty is to remain Duchess of Blackwood, nothing more." He had given her a title and a cage. She had used it to build a kingdom. He looked around the opulent study, at the symbols of his power and his heritage, and saw nothing but the trappings of his own profound, catastrophic blindness. The only thing of value he possessed in the world was the one thing he had thrown away. The journey north this time was not an inconvenience. It was a pilgrimage. Alistair travelled in a hired coach, having already sold his own carriage and horses. The lacquered black box of his pride was gone, replaced by the humble, jolting reality of his new circumstances.
He did not notice the roads or the inns. He was consumed by a single, terrifying thought. What would he say to her? What words were there for a man who had treated a treasure as if it were trash? "I am sorry" was a pathetic understatement. "I was wrong" was an insult to the sheer scale of his folly. He had no excuses. The wound from Isabel, which he had carried for so long like a tragic medal, now seemed what it was: a festering self-indulgence, an excuse to treat the world with suspicion and his new wife with contempt. He had organized his life around a past pain and called it principle. Althea had organized her life around a present reality and called it work. He arrived at Stonefall as dusk was falling. The castle was no longer a stark silhouette against the sky. It was a warm, living place, with lights shining from a dozen windows. The sound of a pianoforte, played with delicate skill, drifted from one of the open windows in the west wing. He had not known she played. It was another thing he had never bothered to ask. He did not go to the main entrance. He walked around the side of the keep, past the newly productive kitchen gardens, their neat rows sleeping under a blanket of straw. He came to the winter garden, a structure of glass and iron that Thorne had designed, built against the south-facing wall of the library. He had seen the plans for it on his last visit, another of Althea's projects. Through the glass, he saw her. She was not playing the piano. She was standing with a small watering can, tending to a collection of ferns and winter-blooming jasmine.
The light from a single lamp cast a warm glow on her face, illuminating the thoughtful concentration in her expression. She was wearing the same simple wool dress, with a smudge of dirt on one cheek. She looked serene, capable, and utterly at peace. He opened the door to the conservatory. The air inside was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. She looked up, her hand freezing in mid-air. The calm in her eyes was replaced by a guarded watchfulness. She did not smile. "Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet. She set down the watering can. He did not know where to begin. The grand speeches he had rehearsed in the carriage evaporated. He was left with nothing but the raw, unvarnished truth. "I received a letter from Mr. Thorne," he began, his voice hoarse. She nodded, waiting. "He sent the accounts." He took a step closer. She did not move back, but her stillness was a wall. "The money, it will be enough to... It will save Ashworth. For now." "I am glad to hear it," she said, her tone polite, distant. The tone one uses with a stranger. And the distance broke him. "Glad to hear it," he repeated, a raw, incredulous laugh escaping him. "Althea, He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I sent you here, to this ruin. I sent you here to get rid of you. I thought you were nothing, a convenience, a quiet, empty space where a duchess was supposed to be." He took another step. He could see her face clearly now, the disciplined set of her jaw. He saw the flicker of old pain in her eyes, the pain he had put there on their wedding night. "I stayed in my palace," he continued, the words tumbling out, stripped of all artifice. "I surrounded myself with my wealth and my pride, and I made it a tomb. I was blind. I was a fool, so wrapped up in a past injury that I could not see the miracle standing in front of me. You are not a quiet, empty space. You are this." He gestured around the conservatory,
at the thriving plants, the solid walls of the castle visible through the glass. "You are life. You are genius. You are the most competent, brilliant, extraordinary person I have ever known. And I treated you like a piece of furniture." He looked down at his hands. "I don't deserve your help. I don't deserve to stand in this place you have built. God knows, I do not deserve you." He looked up at her again. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was confessing. He was laying the ugly, wretched facts of his failure at her feet, because it was the only honest thing he had left to give her. She was silent for a long time. The only sound was the sigh of the wind outside the glass. He watched her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had faced down political rivals, hostile crowds, the scorn of his peers. He had never felt terror like this. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Why are you here, Alistair?" It was the first time she had ever used his given name. The sound of it on her lips was both a balm and a wound. "I don't know," he answered with brutal honesty. "Because there is nowhere else to go. Because this is the only place that feels real. The only thing I own that is not built on lies is this estate. And I do not even own it. You do. You built it." He looked at her hand, and for the first time he noticed. She was not wearing the Blackwood sapphire. In its place was a simple, thin band of silver. His dismissal had been so complete, she had even removed his ring. The sight of it was a knife to the gut. "I am not asking for your forgiveness," he said quietly. "It is not mine to ask for. I am not even asking for your help, though you have already given it. I am here to report for duty, I suppose. If there is a place for me, I will work as a clerk, a laborer, whatever you say. I wish to learn how to build something, instead of merely possessing things until they are lost." He stood before her, stripped of his title.
He was just a man in a garden built by the wife he had wronged. He had given his confession, and now he waited for her judgment. Althea did not give him an answer that night, not in words. After his confession, she simply looked at him, her gaze deep and searching. And then she nodded. It was not a nod of forgiveness or acceptance, but of acknowledgement. She had heard him. She picked up a small basket and began snipping herbs from a planter, her movements deliberate and calm. "Mrs. Gable will have prepared a room for you," she said, her back to him. "In the east wing. It is simple, but warm." The east wing was where the senior staff were housed. She was not giving him the master's chambers. She was giving him a room. He was, for now, a resident, not a ruler. It was more than he deserved. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt inadequate for the immensity of the gesture. He did not leave. He stayed. The days that followed were a strange, humbling education. He rose at dawn with the rest of the household. He took his meals not in state with the duchess, but in the small dining room with Mr. Thorne and the estate steward, a new man Althea had hired. He presented himself in the library each morning, where Althea would give him his tasks for the day. At first they were simple. She had him copying accounts into a new ledger. His elegant, aristocratic script looked foreign next to the practical purpose of the numbers. He spent a week in the estate office, sorting and archiving decades of neglected correspondence. He learned the names of the tenant families, the histories of their land, the complex web of relationships and obligations that made up the estate. He was seeing the anatomy of his own world for the first time. One morning, she handed him not a ledger, but a pair of sturdy boots and a heavy coat. "Mr. Gable is inspecting the fences on the North Moor," she said. "He could use a second pair of hands. The wind is strong today." He spent the day walking the bleak, beautiful landscape, carrying tools and helping the gnarled, silent groundsman replace rotten posts. The work was cold and hard. The wind cut to the bone. By the end of the day, his hands were raw, and his muscles ached with a satisfying pain. He returned to the castle exhausted, muddy, and feeling more useful than he had in his entire life. He began to work alongside Thorne, learning the rudiments of architecture. He was not a natural designer like Althea, but his mind was sharp and logical. He learned to read plans, to calculate stresses, to understand the language of stone and timber. He saw the castle not as an inheritance, but as a complex machine that Althea had taken apart and was meticulously reassembling. He sold Ashworth. The decision was his, but the courage to make it came from her. He traveled to London for a final, grim week, meeting with lawyers and creditors. He signed the papers that passed his ancestral home, the seat of the Blackwood Dukes for 400 years, into the hands of a manufacturing baron from the Midlands. He felt a pang of loss, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of release. He was cutting away the last vestiges of his hollow pride. The money cleared his debts and left him with a modest but stable capital. He was no longer a great landowner. He was solvent. When he returned to Stonefall, he found Althea in the garden, overseeing the planting of a new orchard. He walked over to her, his boots sinking into the soft, tilled earth. "It is done," he said. "Ashworth is sold." She looked up at him, her hands covered in soil. She held his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not just watchfulness, but a flicker of something warmer. "Are you at peace with it?" she asked. "Strangely, yes," he said. "It was a beautiful house, but it was never a home." He looked around at the gray stone of Stonefall, at the hardy saplings being planted in neat rows. "This is a home." He stayed. The seasons turned. Winter's starkness gave way to the pale green of a northern spring. He learned the rhythms of the land, the slow, patient work of building. He and Althea still moved around each other with a careful courtesy, but the space between them was shrinking. They fell into a habit of working together in the library in the evenings, the silence no longer thick with unspoken resentments, but comfortable, companionable. He learned about her father, about her lonely childhood spent in a world of books, about the strength she had forged in solitude. He, in turn, told her of his own upbringing, of the crushing weight of his father's expectations, of the public humiliation with Isabel, not as an excuse, but as a simple, factual history. He was showing her the pieces of himself, letting her see him in his entirety. One evening he went to his room and found a small, polished box on his dresser. He opened it. Inside, on a bed of velvet, lay the Blackwood sapphire ring. There was no note. He knew what it was. A question. A possibility. He took the box and went to the library. She was there, reading by the fire. He walked over and stood before her, holding out the box. She looked up, her expression calm. "Althea," he said, his voice quiet. "I know what this ring meant the first time I gave it to you. It was a symbol of a transaction, a claim of ownership. That is not what I want it to be. He opened the box. The sapphire glittered in the firelight. I am not asking you to be my duchess. I am asking if you will be my wife. In truth. As my partner. As my equal. As the person I admire more than anyone in the world. He did not try to take her hand. He simply held the box out to her. It was her choice. She looked at the ring, then back at his face. She reached out and took the ring from the box, but she did not put it on her finger. She held it in her palm for a moment, then walked to a small desk and picked up a thin silver chain. She threaded the chain through the ring and fastened it around her neck. The sapphire came to rest at the hollow of her throat, a point of deep blue against her skin. Trust, you once told me, is an asset to be built, she said softly, her fingers touching the ring. This is a start. It was not a complete victory. It was not a passionate reunion. It was something far more precious. It was hope. It was the beginning of the slow, patient work of earning what he had once simply taken for granted. He looked at the ring on the chain, not a manacle, but a promise, and felt a gratitude so profound it was akin to grace. 5 years later, Stonefall was a jewel of the north. The castle was fully restored, its stone walls warm and welcoming, its gardens a masterpiece of color and design that bloomed even in the harsh climate. The estate was not just solvent, it was prosperous, a model of innovative and compassionate land management studied by agriculturalists from across the country. It was a world born of Althea's vision and brought to life by their shared work. The great library was the heart of the home, its fires always lit, its tables laden with books and drawings, and the occasional stray toy soldier. On a cool autumn evening, Alistair sat in a large wingback chair by the fire. A small, dark-haired boy of 3 curled asleep on his lap, his breathing soft and even. The boy had Alistair's gray eyes and Althea's quiet, thoughtful nature. Althea sat opposite them, a ledger open on her lap, though she was not reading it. She was watching her husband and her son, a soft, private smile on her face. The 5 years had settled them into a partnership that was as solid and dependable as the castle walls. The passion had come, not in a sudden fire, but as a slow, deep warmth, a current that ran beneath the surface of their shared days and quiet nights. He was no longer the cold, wounded duke, but a man made whole by the love of a woman he had once been too blind to see. He was quieter, gentler, his authority now resting not on his title, but on his wisdom and his integrity. Alistair looked up and met her gaze across the hearth. He smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. He shifted the sleeping boy in his arms and reached out his free hand to her. She put her own hand in his, her fingers lacing with his. On the 3rd finger of her left hand, 2 rings sat side by side. One was a simple, thin band of silver, the ring she had worn in her exile, a reminder of her own strength and self-sufficiency. Next to it, its deep blue glowing in the firelight, was the Blackwood sapphire. It was no longer a symbol of a transaction or a claim of ownership. It was a choice, freely made. It was a testament to the fact that their union had not erased who she was, but had, instead, finally allowed her to be fully seen. The castle was their fortress, the land their legacy, and the quiet peace of this room was the earned, and most precious, triumph of their lives.